For most people, the global economy feels permanent. Stores stay stocked, packages arrive on time, prices rise and fall, but the system itself seems immovable. Yet the modern world rests on an arrangement that is surprisingly young. After World War II, a new economic model emerged. One nation became the primary consumer. Others became manufacturing centers. Resource-rich countries supplied the fuel, metals, and materials that kept production moving. Goods flowed across oceans, capital flowed across borders, and prosperity spread at a scale humanity had never witnessed. The mechanism was simple, but powerful: global capital flows. Companies could invest wherever labor was cheaper, produce at lower costs, and sell into larger markets. Consumers gained access to affordable products. Governments enjoyed rising revenues and expanding middle classes. Success reinforced success. Over time, something else happened. Businesses stopped treating globalization as an opportunity and began treating it as a certainty. Supply chains stretched across continents. Critical industries became dependent on distant factories. Entire economies grew reliant on partners they could not control. The system looked stronger with every new connection. But history often hides risk inside success. The more efficient the network became, the less resilient it became. A disruption in one region could suddenly affect industries thousands of miles away. What appeared to be stability was quietly becoming dependence. And that dependence would eventually collide with reality. But the real weakness was still hidden. For nearly half a century, globalization looked unstoppable. Each year, the world seemed to become more connected, more efficient, and more prosperous. Advances in shipping, telecommunications, and technology allowed businesses to coordinate production across continents as if distance barely existed. Borders mattered less. Markets mattered more. The mechanism driving this transformation was simple: capital flows. Money moved to wherever production was most efficient. Factories expanded where labor costs were lower. Investment followed opportunity. As costs fell, consumers gained access to cheaper products, creating even greater demand. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle. A smartphone could involve components from dozens of countries before reaching a customer's hands. Every link in the chain specialized in doing one thing better, faster, or cheaper than anyone else. Efficiency became the defining principle of the global economy. China's rise illustrated this process more clearly than any other example. Foreign investment poured in, manufacturing capacity exploded, and hundreds of millions of people entered the global marketplace. To many observers, this seemed like proof that economic integration was the natural direction of history, and because the system kept delivering results, few questioned its assumptions. That was the insight most people missed. Success can conceal risk. The more efficient the network became, the more it depended on every link functioning perfectly. The system appeared stronger than ever. But beneath the prosperity, a critical weakness was quietly growing. The greatest weakness of the global economy did not come from failure. It came from success. For decades, businesses pursued a single goal: maximum efficiency. Every extra warehouse was considered waste. Every backup supplier reduced profits. Every layer of redundancy was stripped away in the name of optimization. The mechanism was driven by institutional incentives. Executives were rewarded for cutting costs. Investors favored higher margins. Governments welcomed faster growth. Everyone benefited from efficiency today, while the risks remained hidden in the future. Gradually, entire industries became dependent on a small number of suppliers and production hubs. Critical components traveled thousands of miles before reaching factories. Essential materials often came from a single region. On paper, the system looked stronger than ever. In reality, it resembled a bridge engineered to carry maximum weight with no margin for error. As long as conditions remained perfect, it performed brilliantly. But resilience had been sacrificed for speed. That was the insight few people recognized. Economic logic and strategic security are not always the same thing. Nations do not make decisions based solely on profit. They also pursue influence, power, and survival. The global economy had been built on the assumption that cooperation would continue indefinitely. History rarely works that way, and when the first serious disruptions appeared, the hidden cost of efficiency became impossible to ignore. For years, the global economy appeared almost indestructible. Then the stress tests began. The first major shock arrived in 2008. What started as a crisis inside the American housing market quickly spread through global financial networks. The mechanism was interconnected capital flows. Banks, investors, and institutions across continents were tied together so tightly that a problem in one market became a problem everywhere. It was an early warning, but the deeper lesson was still ignored. As the years passed, geopolitical tensions intensified. Nations that once viewed each other primarily as economic partners increasingly saw strategic rivals. Trade was no longer just about profits. It was becoming a matter of national security. Then came the pandemic. Factories stopped. Ports clogged. Shipping delays stretched for months. Businesses discovered that critical components could suddenly become unavailable. Consumers who had grown accustomed to abundance encountered shortages that seemed unimaginable in the modern world. The insight was impossible to miss. Efficiency works brilliantly during stability. It becomes far less impressive during disruption. For decades, the global economy had been optimized for speed, cost, and growth. Very little attention had been paid to resilience. Now governments and corporations were asking a different question. Not how to make the system faster, how to make it survive. And that change in thinking would reshape the economic map of the world. For decades, businesses lived by a simple rule. The lowest cost wins. Factories were relocated, suppliers consolidated, and production concentrated wherever expenses were lowest. The institutional incentives were clear. Lower costs meant higher profits. Higher profits attracted investment. Efficiency became the dominant measure of success. Then, the world changed. Disruptions revealed a flaw hidden inside that logic. The cheapest supply chain was often the most fragile. A single factory closure, shipping delay, or trade restriction could ripple across entire industries. Suddenly, companies were confronting a new reality. A backup supplier might cost more. Extra inventory might reduce margins. Local production might be less efficient. Yet all three increased the odds of surviving a crisis. The insight was profound. In an uncertain world, resilience has economic value. What had once been dismissed as waste began to look like insurance. Governments reached the same conclusion. Industries such as semiconductors, energy, and pharmaceuticals were no longer viewed as ordinary markets. They were increasingly treated as strategic assets tied to national security and long-term stability. As a result, capital flows started changing direction. Investment began moving toward redundancy, domestic production, and supply chain diversification, rather than pure cost reduction. This was more than a business adjustment. It was the beginning of a new economic philosophy, and the regions positioned to benefit from that shift were about to gain enormous advantages. The world economy is not being dismantled. It is being rewired. These changes do not happen in a single announcement or a single crisis. They emerge from millions of decisions made by executives, investors, and governments responding to the same concern: vulnerability. The mechanism driving this shift is capital flows. Investment is increasingly moving toward locations that offer not only low costs, but also political stability, reliable infrastructure, and strategic alignment. Where money goes, factories, jobs, and industries often follow. Across the world, supply chains that took decades to build are being redesigned. Companies are bringing production closer to major markets. Governments are spending billions to attract semiconductor plants, energy projects, and advanced manufacturing facilities. The insight is simple. Economic geography is no longer being shaped primarily by efficiency. It is increasingly being shaped by security. Think of it as a global rerouting of economic traffic. The roads still exist. Trade still flows. But the preferred routes are changing. That shift may seem gradual today. Yet history shows that when production networks move, wealth, influence, and opportunity often move with them. The countries that adapt fastest could become the industrial centers of the next era, and those that fail to adjust may discover that yesterday's advantages no longer guarantee tomorrow's success. Every major economic transition creates a simple question: who benefits? History shows that when the rules of the economy change, wealth rarely stays in the same place. The Industrial Revolution shifted power toward nations that mastered manufacturing. The globalization era rewarded countries that became essential links in global trade. A similar process is unfolding today. The mechanism is capital flows. Investment is increasingly moving toward regions that offer strategic resources, reliable energy, industrial capacity, and favorable demographics. These are becoming the assets of the new era. Countries with growing workforces and critical materials may find themselves attracting factories, infrastructure projects, and long-term investment. At the same time, economies burdened by aging populations or heavy debt may struggle to maintain the advantages they once enjoyed. The insight is that economic success is never permanent. Many nations built their prosperity around assumptions that belonged to a different world. As those assumptions change, so do the opportunities. The same shift is occurring across industries. Capital is flowing toward advanced manufacturing, automation, energy security, semiconductors, and critical infrastructure. These sectors are increasingly positioned at the center of future growth. The transformation is already underway. Factories are moving, investments are moving, strategic priorities are moving, and before long, these global changes will stop looking like distant economic trends and start affecting the daily lives of ordinary people. It is easy to think of economic change as something that happens far away. In government offices, corporate boardrooms, international summits, but every major economic shift eventually arrives at your front door. The mechanism is simple. When capital flows change, jobs, wages, prices, and investment opportunities change with them. What begins as a decision about factories or supply chains eventually influences everyday life. For decades, globalization helped keep many goods inexpensive by prioritizing the lowest possible production costs. As resilience becomes a greater priority, that equation begins to change. More secure supply chains often require additional investment, backup capacity, and domestic production. Those costs do not disappear. At the same time, new opportunities are emerging. Industries tied to automation, advanced manufacturing, energy infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and critical resources are attracting enormous amounts of capital. Where investment concentrates, opportunity often follows. The insight is that economic transitions rarely reward everyone equally. Some people continue planning for a world that is fading. Others recognize the shift early and adapt to it. The difference is not luck, it is awareness. History shows that the biggest transformations are usually obvious only in hindsight. The one unfolding today is still being written. And the choices people make during the transition may determine who benefits from the next economic era and who gets left behind. History's most important transformations rarely announce themselves. The people living through them usually believe they are experiencing temporary disruptions, not the birth of a new era. That is what makes the current moment so significant. For nearly 80 years, the global economy operated according to a familiar set of assumptions. Efficiency came first. Production moved wherever costs were lowest. Trade expanded across ever greater distances. The system generated extraordinary prosperity and became the foundation of modern life. Now those assumptions are changing. The mechanism driving this shift is a redirection of capital flows. Governments are investing in strategic industries. Corporations are redesigning supply networks. Resources are being allocated toward resilience, domestic capacity, and technological independence, rather than maximum efficiency alone. The insight is not that globalization is disappearing. It is evolving. Just as industrialization transformed the 19th century and the information age transformed the late 20th, a new economic framework is beginning to take shape beneath familiar headlines and daily routines. Most people will not recognize the scale of the transition until years after it has occurred. By then, new centers of wealth may already be established. New industries may already dominate. New opportunities may already belong to those who positioned themselves early. The biggest economic shift since World War II is no longer a future possibility. It is already underway.